Hi there, I'm Sean. So this video is going to cover how to create improvised bandages and dressings from materials that you can find at your house to accomplish bleeding control. Now this video is not going to cover all the theory behind bleeding control. That's beyond the scope of this video. Hopefully you have that background and foundational knowledge prior to doing what we're about to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace professional materials. So this is the blood stopper pressure dressing, and this is a combat application tourniquet. So I'm going to use materials around my house to replace these. The thought process is I don't have these available, there's an immediate emergency, my help is delayed, or my time to get to help is delayed, say backpacking, or maybe it's a natural disaster, you are in a metro area but help is delayed. Either way, this is just a temporary improvised measure. Now, one of the things I would like you to remind you about bleeding control is we are concerned about infection and not creating any type of infectious materials. Anything you improvise for medical supplies obviously is not sterile, therefore could place the patient at risk for an infection. So you want to have that in mind. But the other thing to think about is a patient will die quicker from an uncontrolled bleed rather than they will for the complications of an infection. On a side note with infection, before we get into the actual creation of materials, is you want to keep wounds clean. Now, there's a difference between a wound that is going to need stitches versus, say a deeper cut or some kind of cut or scrape. It will not need stitches. And since we're talking about improvised materials, one thing that most people have around their house, believe it or not, is, well, not believe it or not they have it, but a lot of people have honey around their house. But the believe it or not part is that honey is actually a really, it's a natural product that can actually be used for infection prevention. So if you have a cut, that doesn't require stitches, of course you want to clean that cut out first. You don't want to pull anything embedded or anything like that, but a basic cut, rinse it out with water, make sure it's clean, and then you just apply this honey over to the wound and draw out some of the fluids, and it creates an environment where infections can't grow. And actually there's some research out there that shows actually this can actually reduce scarring as well. So things to think about. If you have a cut, you want to provide an antibiotic and you don't have it in your house, you don't have the stuff you bought from CVS, this is a natural and acceptable alternative to infection control. Now moving along, so let's talk about bandages and dressings as a review for those of you who it's been a while or you haven't had the training. Right, a dressing is a material that goes directly on top of the wound to prevent infection and allow the body's natural clot processes to take over, right? So a dressing is the material that actually goes on top of the wound, right? Bandaging is the material that wraps around and holds the dressing in place, okay? So what we're going to do right now, right, is we're going to create a bandage and a dressing from a simple t-shirt, okay? So we'll start off, get your t-shirt out, go get a t-shirt and a pair of scissors, right? And the first thing we're going to do is cut off the sleeves. So I'll attempt to do this on camera. There's one. And there's two. Now we have dressings. If I have a cut, right, I can apply this on top of it, and now I need something to hold that in place, would be the bandage. Again, not a replacement for professional medical materials with consideration to preventing infection. This is not sterile. Your patient could potentially get infected from this. So the idea is a temporary stabilization and allows you and buys you some time to get them to the hospital or doctor. Okay, so now I have my improvised dressings from the sleeves I cut. Now, to create my bandages, right? So I have the t-shirt cut now. What I want to do from here is I want to make a continuous cut, sort of like a spiral pattern, right? Which will allow this to unravel and create a long length. So I'm just going to start cutting. I'm just going to start cutting here in a circle. in a spiral technique. So hopefully, let's see if this works out. You can see the camera demonstration, right? I'm going to start creating my cut in a spiral pattern. Ideally, creating one continuous bandage. Now, you want to cut it fairly wide, right? When you use a tourniquet for the tourniquet applications, you want material to be at least 1.5 inches wide. So when you cut this, when you're cutting this, you want to cut it fairly wide, right? I think in this kind of application, I like 2 to 3 inches, and I'll show you here in a second. And it can get confusing when you start cutting, but you're just going to keep cutting in a spiral pattern on this shirt. Okay. So this is where, for those of you who maybe have a hobby sewing, you'll have the tactical advantage in turning t-shirts into bandages. You can see what's starting to happen here, right? I found it helps too to actually stand up and kind of cut and hold it. Otherwise you start to get confused, and it just allows that material to sort of drop free. You see this is an old t-shirt, so this has some holes in it anyway. Right, so we're continuing on the spiral pattern. See how that's working out? I just make a little few more, I just extend this out a little bit more, then I'll just cut it and call that part good. We'll call that good enough. Now you can see, right? That was just one t-shirt using that spiral cut, right? I created my bandaging. Now, using myself as a patient, we're going to say let's say I have a cut on my arm here, right? So I have a pretty decent cut there that I need to dress and bandage. So we'll begin with the improvised dressing. Okay. Then when you start with your dressing, you want to hold direct pressure for a few minutes to hopefully reduce the pressure and allow the body to start creating a few clots, or let the clotting process start to begin. So I'm going to hold that on there to reduce some of the bleeding, hopefully, right? And what I can also do, if just the direct pressure doesn't work, is to create a little bit of a pressure, so a pressure dressing. The idea is pushing in a little bit deeper, right, allowing and compressing more of those veins, right, the capillaries and veins, to allow the clot process to come over. So you can see now I have a little bit, now it becomes a little bit of a wider portion. And if you look on the packaging for this blood, if you Google it and you look this up online yourself, the blood stopper, you see what I'm doing is I'm creating my own blood stopper bandage, improvised. So this is pushing down, pushing in a little bit harder, allowing more clotting to take over. And this is, I'll try and get as creative as I can with a one-person, one-handed demonstration. But now, what I need to do is wrap this very tight. All right. This is the worst case scenario, right? You got cut, you got hurt, and there's no one around to help you. I'm going to sit down for a little bit, just because this will be easier for me to do than standing in front of the camera and demonstrate. I'm going to wrap this around and tuck it in, and we'll see how tight I can actually get it using just this bandage. I'm just making some adjustments and modifications to try and get this as tight as I can. Not to keep saying the same things over and over again, but remember this is improvised. Ideally, just spend a couple bucks and have the real stuff available at home. So I finished it. So you can see this is pretty not bad for an improvised dressing. This is basically an improvised pressure dressing. So you can see I have the middle material where the dressings were. And I rolled them up and made the material a little bit thicker to allow it to press down a little bit further to create sort of a pressure type dressing. And then I wrapped it around for the bandages. And if you could see in my hands, my veins are starting to pop out a little bit. My hands are becoming a little bit paler. Right? Now you don't want this so tight that it's going to totally stop circulation, but you want it tight enough to stop the bleeding, which I believe I've accomplished. And this was a t-shirt just a few minutes ago. Now, the bleeding continues. And we're talking limbs only, you can't control the bleeding, then you're going to have to consider using a tourniquet on your patient. And I'm going to show you right now how to use and create an improvised tourniquet and how to apply it. So I'm going to take this off for a second. And now for your supplies that you'll need. It could be another, you can reuse the same type of material, right? But if you notice it's a cotton t-shirt, got a little bit of a stretch to it. One thing that I like is my favorite improvised material for tourniquet applications are ties, right? So things to consider for a tourniquet application for the material. You want the material to be at least 1.5 inches wide, right? 1.5 inches wide. You don't want anything skinny or narrow like zip ties, cable, anything else, because what that will do, you'll see here in a minute when we start winding it up with the windlass, it's going to compress the tissue. Right, and you can create, it's just going to start compressing and cutting through, not just sort of cutting, but really damaging deep into tissue. So this sort of distributes the pressure around there. Now, when you apply a tourniquet, the tourniquet application has to be to the point where bleeding stops. And to really do that, you really have to crank down on that tourniquet. So they're extremely painful for the patient, providing there's they still have nerve-ending sensation in the limb, in the affected limb. It's going to be very painful for the patient, and you keep going until the bleeding stops. Once the bleeding stops, you're going to note the time you place the tourniquet on the patient. It's very important for the medical professionals when you transfer them, because remember, this is only a temporary stabilization until you get them to the hospital or doctor. Okay, so you're going to note the time that you put it on, and you're going to monitor your patient while they're in your care for signs and symptoms of shock, right? So for this demonstration, again, I'm going to use a tie. So you need the material that's at least 1.5 inches wide. Also, some type of unbreakable material. I'm going to use just a simple kitchen utensil, kitchen knife with a dull edge. And I'm also going to use a key ring. I'll show you here in a second why I'm going to do all that. So hopefully I'm going to stand back here and apply this on my leg right now. Okay? So we'll say I got a cut here, right? And it's a deep cut and it's bleeding. Now, you want to apply your tourniquet upstream, basically away towards the heart from where the cut is. So if the cut is here, moving back upstream towards the heart would be above it. So above the cut is where you're going to place it. I'm going to come across with my tourniquet, improvised tourniquet, above the cut, and I'm going to tie a simple knot. Okay? So there's the first part of the knot. Now the second part, I'm bringing in my windlass and placing it right in the center of where I just cut it, where I just tied. Okay, so you can see there, I've got that. Maybe I'll do this instead. A little better so you get a frontal view. Okay, so I have my first tie. Now I'm going to tie it again So I tied it. I placed my windlass over the first tie. I'm going to tie it again, which captures the windlass. Okay, so you can see I got this, and I got my windlass. Now the windlass is a device that you turn, which is going to create the pressure to stop the bleed. So I'm going to start turning it. And this is, now you can see why I used the kitchen utensil, because if this was a pen or a pencil, it would break. If you have flimsy material for the tourniquet, you start doing this, it's just going to snap and break. So it's got to be relatively stout material. And this is actually starting to hurt. You can see on the side here, I'm starting to compress actually into my leg. Now I can actually keep doing this and create, if I keep doing this, I can create bruising. And actually, I can, if I go super deep and continue on, I can actually start damaging nerves just with this material right here. For demonstration purposes, you can see this is super tight. This is super painful at this point. Now, if I were to now that I have it now I have it turned off, the bleeding stop, I guarantee you. But what now? Because I turn this, if I let go, what's going to happen? You see how I just spin and undid itself? So you need a way to secure this from untying. So I'm going to get it back to where it should be. And this is where my key ring comes into play. Right? And you're going to have to mess with this on your own, again, to learn how to do it. But what I'm going to do is I want to create something that secures this in place and prevents basically the force that holds it in the opposite direction of the unwinding direction, if that makes sense. So if I let go, this is going to unwind this way, right? It's going to unwind this way, so I want to hold it in the opposite direction. So that's where the key ring comes into play. I tie the key ring in. And then what I can do is tie off my tourniquet as such, keep it from unraveling. You can also do this with the material itself. Again, you're going to have to get in there and mess with this. It's really hard to show this type of skill, or it's hard to learn this type of skill without actually practicing and applying it yourself, just by watching on the video. Now, this is completely secure. It's not going anywhere, right? I mark the time, and I would get myself transported to the hospital. Also, the whole time monitoring for signs and symptoms of shock, which the very first and easy recognized sign, or actually this would be symptom, I would guess, would be altered mental status. So signs and symptoms of shock would be altered mental status, increased pulse rate, increased respiratory rate. One of the foolproof signs of shock would be pale, cool, moist skins. So if I have a patient after this type of accident where I had to apply a tourniquet and they have pale, cool, moist skins and they have altered mental status, they're going into shock. If your patient is starting to show or exhibit signs and symptoms of shock, one of the key goals and considerations is going to be to make sure, right, that you do as much as you can as possible for the patient's own body to try and heal itself. So the body has its own system that creates clots and repairs the damage, but it does not work if your patient is hypothermic. So you have to keep them warm to keep that clotting process turned on. If they become hypothermic, or if they start to lose core body temperature, the clotting process turns off. Now, if you start to lose blood, right, you think about it, if you can think about you losing blood, you will also start to lose body core temperature. So it's a nasty cascading effect. So again, now there used to be a heavy emphasis on getting the patient on the ground and elevating their legs above the level of their heart. The idea is to return blood back to the core. There's different schools of thought on that with modern research. Some say it's only a temporary solution. Others don't recommend. Some still do recommend it. It depends upon which camp or which doctor, which body of research you're looking at. But what's undisputed is the fact that keeping them warm and maintaining their body core temperature will allow the body to continue to try and do that damage repair and create clots. So you want to keep them warm. All right, well, that concludes my home demonstration of improvised dressings, bandage, and tourniquets. I hope you learned a lot, and I will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.